Good afternoon. Glad that you've chosen to spend some time studying the Bible with us today. Today we're looking at Genesis chapter 1, verses 2 through 5. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. As we press into Genesis at the beginning here, I didn't mention last time that Genesis, for virtually the whole time people have been reading it, has been accepted to have been written by Moses. The first 5 books of the Bible are considered to be written by Moses. Now, if you are somebody that likes to read commentaries, you will discover that the commentators don't always agree on that. However, I just have to tell you that personally, since this has been part of the Hebrew Bible for thousands of years, and they have always accepted that it was Moses that wrote it, I'm not sure if there's a compelling reason to just say, well, it couldn't have been Moses. Because, it seems like part of the reason people want to say, well, it had to have been someone else. It seems like part of the reason is that, Moses wasn't there, which is silliness, because I've recently read a history of the fall of the Roman Republic, and it was written like in the last 10 or 15 years. Well, that guy wasn't there either. So that's not a great reason. Without spending lots and lots of time in that, this is another one of those areas where I'm just going to accept that it was Moses that did it, that he did it based on received information, because truly he wasn't there, of course, but also throughout Genesis for a while, you see statements that are, these are the generations of. And the first section here, you could say is the generations of the heavens and the earth. Now, it doesn't state that specifically, but we'll think of it in that terms. That goes all the way to verse 4 of chapter 2. Well, God would have had to be the source of what was going on then. Later on, we'll see that Adam could have been a source, Abraham could have been a source, Jacob could have been a source, and likely these were sources for this story to have been preserved and carried on. So, thinking people disagree, but that's okay. We're just going to accept that that's what that is for now. So as we get to now talking about the actual story of creation, we get to the end of this first day where God says, "Let there be light," there was light, and then ultimately the evening and the morning was the first day. Okay, so there are people that have a real problem with the story of creation because they say it could not have happened on like one 24-hour period. That each thing couldn't have been that one 24-hour period. To which I would point us back to verse 1 that says, "In the beginning, God." If we are going to accept that God is an eternally existent God, that he is above, beyond, outside of everything, that he can do basically everything, does it make a lot of sense to say, wow, I believe in God that is omnipresent, he's everywhere at once, he's omniscient, he knows everything, he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, he can do anything except he can't quite create in a 24-hour. I mean, we all know that's silly. No, that seems like a faulty statement. If Moses had wanted to indicate in his creation story that God used literal 24-hour days for each of the 6 days of creation, if he'd wanted that to come across as really literal, then he would have used the language that we see in the scripture. If he wanted to indicate somehow that each of those days, so-called, of creation were vast time periods, there were about a bunch of better ways he could have indicated that. But he didn't do that. So we're just going to lean on what it says and accept that since God can do anything, he can do that. Okay? Because otherwise we have to ask ourselves, if God existed before all of creation is God's idea. So you have to ask yourself, what are his possible limits? Where does God come to a thing that he might want to do and say, man, I wish I could do that? We experience that on a regular basis, but where does God experience that? Man, if only I had the power to do this. We think that all the time. We might hear the news and we might sit at the supper table and say, boy, if I was in charge of things. Oh, see, God never has to say that because he is in charge of things, because he does have the power. He is limitless. So why not just accept that what the scripture says is what we're going to go with? Now, can you believe it the other way? Is that acceptable to believe in these long eons of geologic history? Is that going to keep you out of heaven? No, not in itself, but I don't think it's going to help your overall theology and doctrine for reasons we'll get into as we go along. See, when we start with man's ideas and then try to make the scriptures fit our preconceived notions, then we always end up limiting scripture. Man's idea is that everything evolved, everything came along. And that's not Charles Darwin's idea. Charles Darwin, got famous by codifying what he thought was an evolutionary process. But the different ancient creation myths are very evolutionary. It is when the scriptures that we don't see that. So is it possible that all of the pagan stories and the scientists that reject God, is it possible that they're right and scripture's wrong? Or is it possible that scripture's right and they are mistaken? I'm going to go with the second. When we start with God's ideas and we then see how our world and our thinking can fit into that, we will not go amiss. So we always want to start with God's way of thinking. Okay? We don't want to limit ourselves to ourselves. If you are your own God, and many people today would never say that, but they kind of have come into that, where you decide what's true, what's not, where you think, well, you have your truth, I have my truth, all that kind of stuff. When you're your own God, that might be okay for a moment, but what happens when you need a miracle? What happens when you come across something you can't handle? Who do you turn to? If I rely on Scripture and I let Scripture be the judge of everything, and I let Scripture stand in judgment over my life rather than my understanding stand in judgment over Scripture, then I have a God to turn to in times of trouble. I have a God that spoke a word and created. Now, I didn't mention to you, I will briefly, that when God created here at the beginning, He's created basically this space and time. He created the matter with which then he will further create. The earth is formless and void because he hasn't created the forces that will actually hold it together. But he's soon going to do that. Well, have a great day. I will be with you again on Saturday. Stay in the Word. God bless.